What happens when a rebellious prince who walked away from royalty meets a ginger-haired singer-songwriter who conquered the world with just a guitar and a loop pedal? The answer might surprise you. It's not about fame, fortune, or fancy palaces. It's about something much more raw and real, the invisible battles we all fight inside our heads. In a world where mental health conversations were once whispered behind closed doors, two unlikely friends decided to turn up the volume. One had grown up in the spotlight, but struggled in the shadows, while the other had climbed from small-town pubs to global stardom, but never forgot the weight of being different. Together, they would create something that nobody expected, a moment of pure, unfiltered honesty that would make millions laugh, cry, and, most importantly, realize they weren't alone. This is the true story of how a simple conversation between friends became a lifeline for countless others, proving that sometimes the most powerful messages come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes, all it takes is two people brave enough to be vulnerable on camera to change everything. The autumn morning was crisp in Montecito, California, as Prince Harry sat in his home office, staring at his phone. The date on the calendar seemed to mock him. October 10th, World Mental Health Day. For most people, it was just another day, but for Harry, it represented everything he had been fighting for since stepping away from royal duties. The weight of expectation sat heavy on his shoulders, not the kind that came with titles and crowns, but the kind that came with purpose. Harry had been thinking about this day for weeks. His mental health advocacy work through his foundation had been gaining momentum, but he knew that reaching people required more than just formal speeches and charity galas. People needed to see that mental health struggles didn't discriminate. They affected everyone, from construction workers to celebrities, from students to, yes, even princes. The problem was finding the right way to get that message across. Traditional PSAs felt stiff and preachy. Formal interviews, while important, often failed to connect with younger audiences who were drowning in social media, but starving for authentic connection. Harry needed something different, something that would cut through the noise and make people actually pay attention. That's when his phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source. Ed Sheeran's name popped up on the screen, and Harry couldn't help but smile. Their friendship had been one of the unexpected gifts of his more relaxed post-royal life. Where once Harry's social circle had been carefully curated by protocol officers, now he could simply be friends with people he genuinely liked and respected. The message was typically Ed, short, direct, and slightly random. "Mate, got any plans for World Mental Health Day? Been thinking we should do something together. Maybe not another boring charity thing, though." People switch off when it gets too serious. Harry read the message twice, then called Ed immediately. The phone rang once before Ed's familiar Suffolk accent came through, already mid-conversation, as if they'd been talking for hours instead of seconds. "Harry, perfect timing. I was just having a cup of tea and thinking about how rubbish most mental health campaigns are. Not that they're bad, just that they all sound the same. You know what I mean? All very serious and medical and important, but people just scroll past them." "I know exactly what you mean," Harry replied, leaning back in his chair. "I've been struggling with the same thing. We need to reach people where they are, not where we think they should be." Ed was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly, becoming more thoughtful. "Thing is, Harry, both of us have been through our own stuff, haven't we? I mean, really been through it. Not just the normal ups and downs everyone has, but the proper dark moments where you wonder if you're actually going mental." Harry felt something click into place. This was exactly what he had been searching for. Not a polished campaign with focus groups and marketing departments, but an honest conversation between two friends who understood what it meant to struggle with mental health while living in the public eye. "What if we just talked?" Harry suggested. "Like really talked. About the real stuff. But made it something people would actually want to watch." "You mean like not hiding behind the usual celebrity speak?" "Exactly. What if we did something completely honest, but made it entertaining too? People are more likely to listen if they're not feeling lectured to." Ed was warming to the idea. "You know what's mad? People always assume that because we're successful or famous or whatever, we've got it all sorted. But success doesn't protect you from your own brain, does it? Not even slightly, Harry agreed. Sometimes I think it makes it worse. Everyone expects you to be grateful all the time, like having opportunities means you're not allowed to struggle. The conversation continued for over an hour, with both men sharing experiences they'd rarely discuss publicly. Ed talked about the anxiety that had plagued him throughout his rise to fame, the way crowds could make him feel simultaneously connected and completely isolated. He described the pressure of constantly having to be on, the expectation that celebrities should always be happy and available and grateful. Harry opened up about his own journey, the delayed grief from losing his mother that had finally caught up with him in his 20s, the way royal protocol had taught him to suppress emotions until he wasn't sure he could access them anymore. He talked about the strange guilt that came with privilege. How do you complain about anything when you've been given so much? The thing that really gets me, Ed said, is when people say stuff like, "What have you got to be depressed about?" As if depression runs a credit check before it moves in. Harry laughed despite the serious subject matter. Or when they act like therapy is something you only need if you're weak. I spent years thinking that asking for help meant I was failing somehow. Same. Took me ages to realize that getting therapy wasn't admitting defeat. It was finally deciding to fight back properly. As their conversation progressed, an idea began to form. What if they created something that captured exactly this? The honesty, the humor, the realization that mental health affected everyone differently. But instead of serious documentary or interview, what if they made something that felt more like eavesdropping on a genuine friendship? People need to see that it's okay to not be okay, Harry mused. But they also need to see that getting help isn't the end of the world. In fact, it can be pretty life-changing. What if we did something for World Mental Health Day that shows both sides? Ed suggested, like the struggle and the solution, but made it something people would actually share with their mates. The idea was taking shape, but they both knew it couldn't be preachy or overly produced. It needed to feel genuine, like something that happened naturally rather than something designed by a committee. You know what I love about our friendship? Ed said suddenly. We can talk about anything. Mental health, music, football, whatever. It doesn't have to be a big, serious thing every time. That's it, Harry said, sitting up straighter. That's exactly it. Mental health doesn't have to be this huge, scary topic that we only discuss in whispers or in doctors' offices. It could just be part of normal conversation between friends. They spent another 20 minutes brainstorming, their excitement building as the concept became clearer. They wanted to create something that would make people laugh, but also make them think, something that would show mental health support in a completely different light. Right? Ed said finally, let's do this, but let's do it properly. No scripts, no focus groups, just us being honest about our experience and making it something people actually want to watch. Agreed. But Ed, yeah, let's make sure we're doing this for the right reasons. Not for publicity or to look good, but because we genuinely think it might help someone. Mate, Ed replied, his voice soft but determined. After everything we've both been through, helping other people navigate this stuff isn't just nice to do. It's essential. As Harry hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Genuine excitement about a project. Not the dutiful enthusiasm he'd learned to perform during royal engagements, but real anticipation for creating something meaningful. He looked at the calendar again. World Mental Health Day, suddenly, seemed full of possibility rather than pressure. Neither man could have predicted that their spontaneous conversation would lead to something that millions of people would see, share, and talk about. They certainly couldn't have imagined that their friendship and shared commitment to mental health awareness would create a moment that perfectly captured what authentic advocacy could look like. But sometimes the best ideas start exactly like this, with two friends having an honest conversation about something that matters to them both. 3 days after their phone conversation, Ed Sheeran found himself driving through the winding roads of Montecito, his rental car's GPS constantly recalculating as he missed turns while lost in thought. He'd been in Los Angeles working on some music projects, but Harry's suggestion had been bouncing around his head like a catchy melody he couldn't shake. The previous evening, Ed had been scrolling through social media when he came across a post from a young fan. The 18-year-old had written a long caption about feeling overwhelmed by university pressure, family expectations, and the constant comparison that social media seemed to encourage. What struck Ed wasn't just the honesty of the post, but the hundreds of comments underneath, other young people sharing similar struggles, offering support, and admitting they felt the same way. This is exactly what Harry and I were talking about. Ed had thought. These kids were already having the conversations about mental health that needed to happen. They just needed to see that it was normal, that successful adults struggled too, and, most importantly, that there were ways to get help that didn't involve dramatic interventions or life-changing revelations. Now, as he pulled into Harry's driveway, Ed felt a familiar flutter of nervous energy. Not the paralyzing anxiety he'd experienced during his earlier career, but the excited nervousness that came before creating something new. He'd learned to distinguish between the two types of anxiety, one that warned him away from situations and another that pulled him toward opportunities. Harry opened the door before Ed had even knocked, clearly having watched for his arrival. The prince looked more relaxed than Ed had seen him in months, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his usual warm smile reaching his eyes. Mate, perfect timing. Megan just took Archie and Lily to their swimming lessons, so we got the house to ourselves for a few hours, Harry said, leading Ed through to the kitchen where 2 cups of tea were already waiting. You've been thinking about this too, haven't you? Ed asked, settling into one of the bar stools. I keep coming back to what we talked about. How do we make mental health conversations feel normal instead of like this huge, scary thing? Exactly that, Harry replied, leaning against the counter. I was up late last night reading some research about how young people actually learn about mental health. Most of it comes from social media, from their friends, from influencers they follow. Very little comes from traditional sources like doctors or official campaigns. It nodded enthusiastically. Which makes sense, doesn't it? When I was struggling in my early 20s, I didn't go looking for help from mental health charities. I talked to my mates. I looked up other musicians who'd been open about similar stuff. I tried to find people who felt like they understood what I was going through. The thing is, Harry continued, we're in this weird position where people might actually listen to us. Not because we're experts, but because we're honest about not having all the answers. They spent the next hour discussing various approaches. Harry had been researching different mental health campaigns, noting which ones gained traction and which ones seemed to disappear without impact. The most successful ones, he noticed, were either deeply personal stories or content that made difficult topics feel approachable. What if we flipped the whole thing on its head? Ed suggested suddenly. Instead of making a serious video about mental health, what if we make something that seems like it's about something else entirely, but actually contains all the important messages? Like what? Ed grinned, the kind of expression that usually preceded his best creative ideas. What if we pretend we're making a different kind of video altogether? Something completely unexpected. Harry raised an eyebrow. I'm intrigued, but also slightly terrified of where this is going. Hear me out, Ed said, pulling out his phone. Everyone expects mental health content to look a certain way, right? Soft lighting, serious conversations, maybe some statistics thrown in. What if we created something that looks like, I don't know, a completely different type of video, but smuggled in all the real talk about mental health? You're thinking like a comedy sketch? Maybe. Or maybe something even more unexpected. The point is people would click on it for entertainment, but leave having learned something important about mental health. Harry was quiet for a moment, considering. You know what I love about that idea? It respects the audience's intelligence. We're not hitting them over the head with messages. We're trusting them to get it. Exactly. And it means we can be ourselves instead of trying to be mental health spokespeople. We could just be 2 mates having a laugh, but also talking about real stuff. They began sketching out ideas, their conversation flowing between serious planning and spontaneous creativity. Ed suggested they film it at Harry's house to keep it intimate and authentic. Harry proposed they include some music element since Ed's songs have been therapeutic for so many people. including Harry himself. The challenge, Harry mused, is making sure we hit the right tone. Funny enough that people want to share it, but real enough that it actually means something. I think the trick is to not try too hard on either front, Ed replied. The funniest moments in friendship are usually completely natural, and the most meaningful conversations happen when you're not forcing them. As they talked, both men realized they were essentially designing a conversation they wished they'd had access to when they were struggling. Something that normalized getting help, showed that successful people dealt with mental health challenges, and, most importantly, demonstrated that talking about these issues could be both serious and lighthearted. You know what? Harry said suddenly. Let's just start filming and see what happens. We can always edit it later, but I think our best content is going to come from us just being natural. Ed looked surprised. You mean like right now? Why not? We're both here, we're both passionate about this, and honestly, some of our best conversations happen completely spontaneously. Within an hour, they had transformed Harry's living room into an informal filming space. Nothing fancy, just Harry's phone set up on a stack of books, good natural lighting from the large windows, and the comfortable couch where they'd had many previous conversations about everything from music to parenthood to mental health. Right? Ed said, settling onto the couch. So what's the premise? What are we pretending this video is about? Harry grinned. What if you're here to help me write a song? For what? I don't know. Something completely ridiculous. A song for my chickens. Ed burst out laughing. Your chickens? Harry, that's either brilliant or completely mental. Maybe both. But think about it. It's unexpected enough that people will be curious, silly enough that people will share it, but it gives us a reason to be hanging out and talking. And while we're pretending to write this ridiculous song, we can have a completely natural conversation about mental health stuff. Exactly. It's not a mental health video disguised as comedy. It's a comedy video that happens to include honest talk about mental health. I was already warming to the idea. So we start with you asking me to help write a song for your chickens. I think you're joking, then I realize you're serious, and we just go from there. And somewhere in the middle of this absurd songwriting session, we end up talking about real stuff. Therapy, anxiety, finding balance, whatever comes up naturally. They spent another 20 minutes working out basic logistics. No script, but a loose structure that would give them direction while allowing for natural conversation. They agreed to keep filming until they felt like they'd captured something authentic, even if it took multiple attempts. The most important thing, Harry said as they prepared to start, is that we don't perform our friendship. People can tell when chemistry is forced. Agreed. And if we start sounding like we're reading from a mental health pamphlet, we stop and try again. Ed looked around the room one more time, taking in the comfortable domestic setting. You know what I love about doing this here? It feels like the kind of conversation that might actually help someone. Not a professional interview or a charity event, just two friends talking honestly. That's exactly what it is, Harry replied. And maybe that's all most people need to see, that these conversations can happen anywhere, between anyone, and they don't have to be this huge dramatic thing. As they settled in front of the camera, both men felt a sense of excitement mixed with purpose. Neither of them could have predicted that their improvised approach would create something that felt both effortlessly entertaining and genuinely meaningful. They certainly couldn't have imagined that their silly premise about writing a song for Harry's chickens would become the vehicle for one of the most shared mental health conversations of the year. But sometimes the best content happens when creative people stop overthinking and start trusting their instincts. And sometimes the most important messages are delivered through the most unexpected packages. The camera had been rolling for exactly 3 minutes when Ed Sheeran looked directly at Prince Harry and said, "Mate, you've got to be taking the piss. A song for your chickens? Seriously?" Harry's face was completely deadpan as he replied, "Ed, I'm being entirely serious. These chickens have been through a lot. They deserve their own anthem." What happened next was pure magic. The kind of unscripted moment that television producers spend millions trying to recreate. Ed's expression shifted from skeptical to bewildered to genuinely amused as he realized Harry wasn't joking. The laugh that erupted from him was so authentic and infectious that even Harry broke character, grinning as he explained his ridiculous request. Right, so you want me, a multi-Grammy-winning songwriter, to help you write a song about your pet chickens? When you put it like that, it sounds mental, doesn't it? It sounds completely mental, Harry, which is exactly why I'm already interested. The natural chemistry between the two friends was immediately apparent. Ed's quick wit played perfectly against Harry's dry humor, and their comfortable dynamic made it feel like viewers were genuinely eavesdropping on a private conversation between close mates. Okay, Ed said, picking up the guitar that Harry had strategically placed nearby. But I need to understand the brief here. What kind of song do chickens need? Are we talking a power ballad? Folk song? Well, they're very sophisticated chickens, Ed. They've been through relationship drama, housing issues, the works. Ed started playing a gentle chord progression, immediately slipping into musician mode, despite the absurd context. Right, so we need something that speaks to the chicken experience. Got it. What viewers couldn't see was how naturally the conversation began to shift. As Ed played around with melodies, Harry started talking about why he'd gotten chickens in the first place. The explanation was genuine. He'd found caring for animals therapeutic during a particularly stressful period. This led to Ed sharing his own experience with finding creative outlets during difficult times. You know what's interesting? Ed said, still playing softly in the background. Sometimes the most ridiculous projects end up being exactly what you need. Like, when I was going through a really tough time a few years ago, I spent weeks writing songs for my cat. Did you actually write songs for your cat? Dead serious. Full albums worth. Never recorded them, but the process of creating something just for the joy of it, not for any commercial purpose, was incredibly healing. Harry leaned forward, intrigued. That's actually not that different from what I'm asking you to do now, is it? Not at all. Sometimes creating something completely silly is the most therapeutic thing you can do. The conversation continued to flow naturally between humor and depth. Ed talked about how music had been his way of processing emotions he couldn't express otherwise. Harry shared how stepping away from formal royal duties had allowed him to rediscover activities that brought him joy rather than obligation. The thing about therapy, Harry said in what seemed like a natural tangent from their chicken song discussion, is that it taught me it's okay to do things just because they make you feel good. Not because they're productive or impressive or because other people expect them. It nodded enthusiastically. Yes, that's exactly what I was trying to tell my therapist for months. I kept feeling guilty about taking time for stupid creative projects when I could be working on important music. You have a therapist? Mate, I've had several therapists. Mental health isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. Sometimes you need different people for different things. The ease with which they discussed therapy was remarkable. There was no dramatic revelation music, no careful explanation of why mental health matters. They talked about their therapist the way other people might discuss their personal trainers, as helpful professionals who provided valuable services. My first therapist was rubbish, Harry admitted with a laugh. Really nice person, but completely wrong for me. Took me ages to realize that finding the right therapist is like finding the right friend. Sometimes you need to try a few before you find someone who gets you. Exactly, and there's no shame in that. You wouldn't stick with a doctor who wasn't helping your physical health, would you? As they continued their mock songwriting session, both men shared insights that were both profound and completely accessible. Ed talked about learning to recognize his anxiety triggers, crowds, social media, pressure to constantly produce new music. Harry discussed how becoming a father had forced him to confront his own childhood trauma so he could be the parent he wanted to be. The weird thing about anxiety, Ed mused while playing a particularly beautiful melody, is that it tries to convince you that you're the only person who feels this way. But then you start talking to people, really talking, not just small talk, and you realize almost everyone is dealing with something. That's what I love about doing stuff like this. Harry gestured at the camera, not the filming part specifically, but just having honest conversations with friends. You realize how much energy we all waste pretending everything's fine when it's actually fine to admit things aren't always fine. The chicken song had by this point become a surprisingly meaningful piece of music. Ed had crafted a gentle, folk-inspired melody that actually worked as a song, while their lyrics had evolved from silly chicken references to genuine reflections on finding peace in simple moments. Right, so far we've got in the garden where you feel safe, pecking around without any haste, Ed sang softly. That's actually quite beautiful, Harry. It's a metaphor, isn't it? Sometimes we all need a safe space to just exist without pressure. Exactly. And sometimes that safe space is therapy, sometimes it's creative projects, sometimes it's just hanging out with chickens. Their laughter was genuine and infectious, but so was the underlying message. Mental health support didn't have to be complicated or dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as creating something silly with a friend, or finding professionals who could help you navigate difficult emotions, or giving yourself permission to enjoy activities that brought you joy. You know what I think people don't realize about mental health? Harry said, as Ed continued playing, it's not just about crisis intervention. It's about building systems in your life that help you stay mentally healthy. Like having friends you can be completely honest with. Exactly. Or creative outlets. Or therapy. Or whatever works for you. The point is being intentional about taking care of your mental health instead of just hoping everything will be fine. Ed stopped playing for a moment, looking directly at the camera. Can I say something to anyone watching this? Harry nodded. If you're struggling with your mental health, that's completely normal. Harry and I have both been there. The difference between struggling and suffering is asking for help. And asking for help doesn't have to be this massive dramatic thing. It can be as simple as talking to a friend, or looking up a therapist, or calling a helpline. And if you're not sure where to start, Harry added, that's also completely normal. Neither of us figured this out overnight. It's an ongoing process of learning what works for you. The camera captured something remarkable in that moment. Two successful men talking about mental health with the same casual honesty they might discuss sports or music. There was no stigma, no shame, just practical advice delivered with warmth and humor. Right? Ed said, picking up the guitar again. Should we finish this chicken song then? Absolutely. These chickens deserve a proper anthem. As they worked on completing their ridiculous but surprisingly meaningful song, both men felt something profound happening. They were creating exactly the kind of content they'd wished existed when they were struggling, something that normalized mental health conversations while also being genuinely entertaining. The final version of their chicken song was sweet, funny, and oddly moving. But more importantly, their conversation had demonstrated that talking about mental health could be natural, accessible, and even enjoyable. They'd proven that these discussions didn't require clinical settings or dramatic confessions. They could happen anywhere, between anyone, as long as people were willing to be honest with each other. Neither Harry nor Ed could have predicted that their experiment would resonate with millions of people. They certainly couldn't have imagined that their silly chicken song would become a genuine anthem for mental health awareness. But sometimes the most powerful messages are delivered through the most unexpected vehicles, and sometimes the most important conversations happen when people stop trying so hard to have important conversations. After they finished filming their main segment, Harry and Ed sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing what had just happened. The camera was still rolling, but neither man was performing anymore. They were simply two friends decompressing after creating something unexpectedly meaningful. That felt different, Ed said finally, setting down his guitar and reaching for his tea, which had gone cold during their extended conversation. Different how? Harry asked, though he suspected he knew what Ed meant. Usually when I do anything related to mental health advocacy, there's this pressure to get it right, to say the perfect thing that will help everyone. But that just felt like us having a normal conversation that happened to be helpful. Harry nodded thoughtfully. I think that's exactly what we were trying to achieve, though. Making these conversations feel normal instead of like some big scary thing that only happens in therapy offices or crisis situations. What viewers wouldn't see was the 20 minutes that followed, where both men continued talking about their own mental health journeys with even more depth and honesty. The camera captured Ed discussing his experience with sudden fame at a young age and how it had taken him years to learn the difference between being grateful for opportunities and feeling guilty for having human emotions. The hardest part for me, Ed explained, was this idea that because I was living my dream, I wasn't allowed to have bad days. Like, I was playing stadiums full of people singing my songs, so how could I possibly be anxious or depressed? That's such a common trap, isn't it? Harry replied, this idea that external success automatically equals internal happiness. I grew up with incredible privilege, and it took me years to realize that privilege doesn't protect you from grief or trauma or mental health struggles. Ed leaned forward, animated by the topic. And the really twisted part is that the pressure to always be grateful actually makes the mental health stuff worse. Because then you're not just dealing with anxiety or depression, you're also dealing with guilt about having those feelings in the first place. Exactly. It becomes this horrible cycle where you're struggling, then you feel bad about struggling, then you struggle with feeling bad about struggling. Their conversation touched on practical matters too. The logistics of finding good mental health support when you're in the public eye, the challenge of maintaining privacy while being open about your struggles, and the responsibility they both felt to use their platforms thoughtfully. One thing I learned, Harry said, is that you can be open about mental health without sharing every detail of your personal journey. It's about finding the balance between being helpful and being appropriate. It nodded vigorously. Yes, like, I can talk about having therapy without explaining exactly what we discuss in my sessions. The point is normalizing the idea of getting help, not providing free entertainment about your personal struggles. They also discussed the unexpected challenges of mental health advocacy. Both men had experienced criticism for speaking openly about their struggles, accusations of attention-seeking, complaints that they should just be grateful for their success, and skepticism about whether famous people could have real mental health problems. The criticism used to really get to me, Ed admitted. I think maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just being dramatic. But my therapist helped me realize that invalidating my own experience because other people have different struggles isn't actually helpful to anyone. That's something I had to learn too, Harry agreed. My grandmother always said that comparison is the thief of joy, and that applies to struggles as well as successes. Someone else's pain doesn't diminish your pain. The conversation naturally evolved to discuss the positive responses they'd both received from fans who appreciated their honesty. Ed shared letters from young musicians who had sought therapy after hearing him discuss it openly. Harry talked about veterans who had connected with his descriptions of delayed grief and trauma processing. Those responses keep me motivated, Harry said. Even when people criticize us for talking about this stuff, I remember that there might be someone out there who needed to hear that it's okay to not be okay, and that getting help is actually really normal and practical, not some last resort for people in crisis, Ed added. As their conversation continued, both men reflected on how their friendship had been partly built around their shared commitment to mental health awareness. They'd bonded over similar experiences with therapy, their mutual understanding of the pressures of public life, and their desire to use their platforms for positive impact. You know what I appreciate about our friendship? Harry said, we can talk about serious stuff without it being heavy all the time. Mental health doesn't have to dominate every conversation. Exactly. It's just part of life, like physical health or career stuff for family drama. It doesn't have to be this separate, scary category. Ed picked up his guitar again and started playing quietly, not performing, but simply enjoying the music. I think that's what we captured in that video. Mental health as just another aspect of normal life that friends might discuss. Along with writing ridiculous songs for your pets, Harry added with a grin. Don't underestimate the therapeutic value of ridiculous creative projects, Ed replied seriously, then laughed at his own earnestness. The afternoon continued with them discussing potential follow-up projects, ways to continue supporting mental health awareness without being preachy or repetitive. They talked about the importance of authenticity in advocacy work and how easy it was for well-intentioned campaigns to become performative rather than helpful. I think the key, Harry mused, is remembering that we're not mental health professionals. We're just two people who have found things that work for us, and we're sharing those experiences in case they help someone else. And being honest when we don't have answers, Ed added. Like, I can share what's worked for me, but I'm not going to pretend that my approach is right for everyone. They also spent time discussing the broader mental health landscape, acknowledging the privilege they had in accessing high-quality care, and the importance of supporting systemic changes that would make mental health resources more accessible for everyone. It's not enough for us to just talk about therapy being helpful, Harry said. We also need to support efforts to make therapy available and affordable for people who can't afford private practice rates. Absolutely. And we need to be honest about the barriers that exist, not just act like getting help is equally easy for everyone. As the afternoon progressed, both men reflected on how much their own mental health advocacy had evolved. Early efforts had sometimes felt performative or overly cautious, but they'd gradually learned to speak more naturally and honestly about these topics. I used to overthink every word when I talked about mental health stuff, Ed admitted. I was so worried about saying the wrong thing that I probably said nothing particularly helpful. Same. I think we both had to learn that perfect is the enemy of good when it comes to these conversations. It's better to speak imperfectly about important topics than to stay silent until you can craft the perfect message. The camera finally stopped rolling as the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows of Harry's living room. Both men felt a sense of accomplishment, not just about the video they'd created, but about the honest conversation they'd shared. You know what? Ed said as he packed up his guitar. I think we actually did write a pretty good song for your chickens. I think we did something better than that, Harry replied. I think we showed people what normal mental health conversations can look like. Neither of them could have predicted the impact their simple, honest conversation would have. They certainly couldn't have imagined that their approach, treating mental health as a normal topic of discussion between friends, would inspire countless other people to have similar conversations in their own lives. But sometimes the most powerful advocacy happens when people stop trying to advocate and simply start being honest about their own experiences. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is demonstrate that difficult topics can be discussed with warmth, humor, and genuine care between people who trust each other. 3 weeks later, Harry was sitting in his garden with Megan, watching their children play while scrolling through his phone in amazement. The video he and Ed had filmed on that spontaneous October afternoon had exploded across social media in ways neither of them had anticipated. Look at this, Harry said, showing Megan his phone screen. It's been shared over 2 million times in the first week alone. Megan smiled, but she wasn't surprised. She'd watched the video the day they filmed it and immediately knew they'd captured something special. It's because it feels real, Harry. People are starved for authentic conversations about mental health. Most of what they see is either too clinical or too performative. The numbers were impressive, but what really struck Harry were the comments and responses. Thousands of people had shared their own mental health stories, thanked him and Ed for normalizing therapy, and many had mentioned that the video had motivated them to seek help for the first time. One comment that particularly moved him came from a university student. I've been putting off calling a therapist for months because it felt like such a big, scary step. But after watching you two talk about therapy like it's just a normal part of life, I realized I was making it more complicated than it needed to be. Called 3 therapists today. Similar stories were pouring in from around the world. Parents were sharing the video with their teenagers to start conversations about mental health. Teachers were using it in schools to discuss the importance of emotional well-being. Mental health organizations were praising the approach for making their resources feel more accessible. Ed called Harry that evening, equally amazed by the response. Mate, have you seen the trend that started? Ed asked, his voice filled with excitement and slight bewilderment. Which trend? People are making their own videos about writing songs for their pets. But they're using it as a way to talk about mental health stuff with their friends. It's like we accidentally created a format for these conversations. Harry pulled up the hashtag Ed mentioned and was astonished to see hundreds of videos of friends, family members, and even strangers discussing mental health while pretending to write ridiculous songs for pets, plants or inanimate objects. The format they'd stumbled upon had become a template for comfortable mental health conversations. "This is incredible," Harry said, scrolling through video after video. "Look at this one. Two teenagers talking about anxiety while writing a song for their goldfish. And this one, a father and son discussing depression while composing an anthem for their lawnmower. It's like we gave people permission to have these conversations in a way that feels safe and fun instead of scary and serious," Ed observed. The professional mental health community had also taken notice. Dr. Sarah Chun, a prominent therapist who specialized in anxiety disorders, had written a detailed analysis of why their video was so effective. She praised their approach for several reasons. It normalized therapy without minimizing its importance, showed that mental health discussions could be lighthearted without being trivial, and demonstrated authentic male friendship that included emotional vulnerability. "What Sheeran and Prince Harry achieved," Dr. Chen wrote, "is something that clinical mental health campaigns often struggle with. They made these conversations feel accessible and normal rather than medical and intimidating." The video had also sparked broader discussions about mental health advocacy in the digital age. Media outlets were analyzing why their approach had succeeded where more traditional campaigns sometimes failed. The consensus seemed to be that authenticity trumped production value, and that treating mental health as a normal part of life was more effective than treating it as a special category requiring careful handling. Harry found himself fielding interview requests and collaboration offers, but he and Ed agreed to be selective about follow-up projects. They didn't want to capitalize on the success in ways that might undermine the authentic spirit of their original conversation. The whole point was that it wasn't calculated, Ed explained during a phone call with Harry. "If we start making mental health content because we know it will go viral, we'll lose what made the original special." Instead, they decided to support the organic movement their video had inspired. They began sharing and commenting on the videos that others were creating, amplifying voices from mental health professionals, and directing people toward legitimate resources for getting help. Harry was particularly moved by the response from military veterans. His work with Invictus Games had connected him with many veterans struggling with mental health challenges, and several had reached out to say that seeing him discuss therapy so casually had helped them overcome their own resistance to seeking help. "For a lot of us," one veteran wrote, "asking for help feels like admitting weakness. But seeing you and Ed talk about therapy like it's just basic self-care, like going to the gym or eating well, that changed how I thought about it." The video had also prompted conversations about male mental health specifically. While both Harry and Ed had been careful not to make gender the focus of their discussion, many commenters noted how rare it was to see men discussing emotions and therapy with such comfort and honesty. Mental health charity organizations began reaching out, asking Harry and Ed to participate in various campaigns. While they were selective about their involvement, they did agree to support initiatives that aligned with their authentic approach to these conversations. "We keep getting asked to do World Mental Health Day campaigns for next year," Ed told Harry during one of their regular check-ins. "But I think the most powerful thing we can do is just keep having honest conversations, not as spokespeople or ambassadors, just as people who happen to have platforms." 6 months after the video was released, academic researchers began studying its impact. A team at Oxford University conducted surveys measuring attitudes toward mental health help seeking before and after watching the video. Their preliminary findings suggested that viewing the content increased viewers' likelihood of considering therapy and reduced stigma around mental health discussions. "What's particularly interesting," explained Dr. James Morrison, the lead researcher, "is that the video seems to have been especially effective with demographics that typically resist mental health messaging. Young men, people from cultures where therapy is stigmatized, and individuals who view themselves as high-functioning." The success of their video also influenced how other celebrities approached mental health advocacy. Several high-profile figures began adopting similar approaches, casual, honest conversations rather than formal campaigns. The entertainment industry started recognizing that authentic personal sharing often had more impact than polished public service announcements. Harry and Ed remained friends, of course, but their collaboration had deepened their individual commitment to mental health advocacy. Harry incorporated their conversational approach into his work with various charities, while Ed began including more explicit mental health content in his concerts and social media presence. I think what we learned, Harry reflected during an interview 6 months later, is that the most powerful advocacy often happens in the space between entertainment and education. People are more open to important messages when they're not feeling lectured to. The video continued to circulate long after its initial viral moment, becoming a resource that people shared during Mental Health Awareness Month, after tragic events that sparked mental health conversations, and simply whenever someone felt like their friends or family might benefit from seeing a positive example of men discussing emotional well-being. Perhaps most importantly, the video had demonstrated that mental health advocacy didn't require expertise or perfect messaging. It required honesty, authenticity, and willingness to be vulnerable. Harry and Ed had proven that sometimes the most helpful thing successful people can do is simply admit that they're human, that they struggle sometimes, and that getting help is both normal and beneficial. Years later, when mental health professionals discussed turning points in public attitudes toward therapy and emotional well-being, many would point to that October afternoon when two friends decided to film themselves writing a silly song for Harry's chickens. It became a case study in effective advocacy, proof that the right message, delivered authentically by the right messengers, could reach millions of people and actually change how they thought about taking care of their mental health. The legacy of their simple video extended far beyond social media metrics or academic studies. It lived on in the countless conversations it inspired, the therapy appointments it motivated, and the gradual cultural shift toward treating mental health with the same casual care we give to physical health. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest gestures, two friends being honest with